My 12-year-old son drank bleach and Lysol after his teacher told the class that people from his culture don't emphasize hygiene like Americans do. He died, asking if he was finally clean enough. Then I found 17 other complaints about her that the school had buried for years. When my son Arjun came home and threw his lunchbox in the trash, I knew something was wrong. But I also knew that if I asked him directly, he would just go to his room and lock the door. When I checked on him before bed, he wasn't there. I found him in the shower at midnight. The water had long gone cold. His skin was red and raw from scrubbing. "Dad, I need to tell you something," he said through chattering teeth. He told me what happened in science class. Mrs. Squelch had walked past his desk and stopped. In front of everyone, she announced, "This is why we need proper ventilation in classrooms." Then she looked directly at him and said, "Some people's cultures don't emphasize hygiene the way Americans do." The whole class laughed. His best friend Marcus moved his desk away from him. I looked at my 12-year-old son expecting to see tears. Instead, I saw rage. "I'm never going to smell again," he said. "Never." At first, I thought he just meant using more deodorant. Boys his age need those reminders anyway. But within a week, our water bill had tripled. He was showering before school, after school, and between every class. The school called because he kept arriving late. "The other kids hold their noses when I walk by," he told me, showing me a bottle of cologne he'd stolen from the mall. "This will fix it." He sprayed so much that his teacher sent him home for triggering her asthma. I tried limiting his shower time, but he started using the garden hose. I found him at 3 a.m. scrubbing his skin with bleach and a kitchen sponge. "It's working," he said as I wrestled the bottle away. "I can feel it cleaning me." His backpack became a pharmacy of products: hand sanitizer, cologne, body spray, scented lotion, and rubbing alcohol. He'd apply them all every hour. His skin cracked and bled, but he kept going. "Did you know Indians have different sweat glands?" he asked one night. "I read it online. We're genetically smellier." The breaking point came when I found him drinking Febreze. He said he'd seen a video about cleaning yourself from the inside out. At the hospital, they pumped his stomach while he cried about the smell of the medical equipment. That's when I did something I'd promised never to do. I told him about his mother, how she'd worked as a night janitor at an office building, how she'd come home exhausted, her uniform reeking of industrial cleaners. "I smell like work," she'd say sadly. She'd gotten sick slowly at first. Headaches became nosebleeds, became something worse. The doctors said it was chemical exposure. Years of breathing in those fumes without proper protection. Her last month was spent in the hospital begging me to open windows. "I can still smell it," she'd whisper. "I'm so sorry I smell." Arjun had been only 4 when she died. He didn't remember her final days. I'd kept that from him on purpose. Now I watched my son heading down the same path, poisoning himself with chemicals just like she had. Dr. Patel diagnosed severe OCD with contamination fears. She prescribed therapy and medication. For a few weeks, things seemed better. Arjun was down to 3 showers a day. He even ate lunch with Marcus again. Then parent-teacher conferences happened. I couldn't attend, but Mrs. Squelch left a voicemail. "I hope Arjun is addressing his hygiene issues," she said. "It's important for all students to maintain American standards of cleanliness." I found Arjun passed out on the bathroom floor, empty bottles of Pine Sol and Lysol beside him. His journal was open to a page that said, "If I drink enough, I'll be clean forever like Mom." The ICU doctor was blunt. "His esophagus is burned. His stomach lining is destroyed. We're doing what we can." They kept him sedated to manage the pain. When he briefly woke, he whispered, "Do I smell better now?" Mrs. Squelch came to the hospital. She brought a fruit basket and a card signed by the class. "I had no idea he was so sensitive," she said. "I was just trying to teach cultural awareness." She left quickly when I stood up. The other parents whispered in the hallway, "Such a tragedy. Mental health is so important." No one mentioned the months of bullying. No one apologized for their kids calling him Curry Boy or Stinky. Arjun's organs started shutting down one by one. The chemicals had done too much damage. He woke up one last time and asked, "Dad, am I clean enough now? Will they like me?" He died at 4:22 a.m. Official cause was multiple organ failure due to ingestion of household chemicals. He was 12 years old. He weighed 67 pounds. I didn't speak at the funeral, not because I wasn't shattered, but because I had every email Mrs. Squelch had sent about cultural differences and classroom comfort. I stared at the folder on my kitchen table. 3 months of emails, parent complaints, and incident reports I'd collected since Arjun's death. Mrs. Squelch had been doing this for years. The first email was from 2019, a Vietnamese mother writing about her daughter coming home in tears after Mrs. Squelch asked if her people ate dogs for lunch. The principal's response was a template about cultural sensitivity training. Nothing happened. Then, 2020, a black father documenting how Mrs. Squelch told his son that some communities have different standards for academic achievement. The boy had gotten a perfect score on his science test. The school offered to move the child to a different class. Mrs. Squelch stayed. I found 17 similar complaints, always about minority students, always dismissed as misunderstandings, always ending with a family quietly withdrawing their child or moving schools. My hands shook as I organized the papers. Each complaint represented a child who'd been humiliated, but none of them had hammered cleaning products. None of them had died. The doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Mrs. Chen from down the street. Her daughter Lisa had been in Arjun's class. I opened the door and she immediately started crying. She pressed a USB drive into my hand. "Lisa recorded it," she whispered, "the day it happened." She felt so guilty for not speaking up. After she left, I plugged in the drive. The video was shaky, clearly filmed from under a desk, but the audio was clear. Mrs. Squelch's voice rang out with practiced cruelty. The laughter that followed made my stomach turn. I heard Arjun's voice, small and confused, asking to go to the bathroom. I made copies of everything. One for the principal, one for the superintendent, one for each school board member. I spent my savings at the print shop, making sure every page was perfect. The principal's secretary barely looked up when I dropped off the first packet. "I'll make sure he gets it," she said, already sliding it into a drawer full of other ignored complaints. The superintendent's office was harder to reach. 3 canceled appointments. 2 instances of being told she was in important meetings. Finally, I waited in the parking lot and handed her the folder through her car window. She promised to review it thoroughly. Her assistant called the next day to say the matter had been referred back to the principal. I started attending school board meetings. At first, first, I just sat in the back. The board members discussed budget concerns and new textbook adoptions while I clutched my folder. When public comment opened, I stood on shaking legs. My son Arjun died because of systematic racism in this district, I began. The board president immediately interrupted to remind me that personnel matters couldn't be discussed in open session. I had 3 minutes. I used them to read the names of every family who'd filed complaints about Mrs. Squelch. The next day, I received a letter from the district's lawyer. It used words like defamation and cease and desist. They were more concerned about protecting themselves than protecting children. I started reaching out to the families from the complaints. Most wouldn't return my calls. The few who did were terrified of retaliation. "We just want to move on," one mother told me. "Please don't drag us into this." But Kenji Tanaka called me back. His son had transferred schools 2 years ago after Mrs. Squelch announced that Asian students might be good at math but lack creativity. He still had the emails, the meetings where administrators suggested his son might be too sensitive. We met at a coffee shop. Kenji brought his own folder, smaller than mine, but just as damning. "She told my son his English was good for someone not born here," he said. "He was born in Portland." Together, we had enough evidence to show a clear pattern, but the district still wouldn't listen. They offered grief counseling. They suggested I was processing my loss by finding someone to blame. They never once addressed the actual complaints. I started documenting everything on social media, not for sympathy or attention, but because I needed people to know. The post about Arjun got a few hundred shares. Comments poured in from other parents with similar stories, not just about Mrs. Squelch, but about teachers across the district who'd never faced consequences. Mrs. Squelch responded by filing her own complaint. She claimed I was harassing her, that I was creating a hostile work environment. The district immediately took action on her behalf, sending me a formal warning about contacting school employees. I drove past the school one afternoon and saw her car in the parking lot. Same spot as always. Same world's best teacher bumper sticker. She was still teaching, still in the same classroom where she'd humiliated my son. The rage that filled me was different from grief. Grief was heavy and slow. This was sharp and electric. I sat in my car for an hour, watching parents pick up their children, wondering which kids went home with that same sick feeling Arjun had carried. That night, I called the families again. This time, I didn't ask them to speak publicly. I just asked them to write letters, anonymous if they needed to be. There's something deeply unsettling about how Mrs. Squelch's comment about ventilation and hygiene managed to completely unravel this poor kid's sense of self-worth. I'm curious why the school seems more worried about protecting this teacher than examining a pattern that's apparently been going on since 2019. Just get their stories on paper. Slowly, the letters came. Some typed, some handwritten, all describing the same pattern of behavior. Comments about food smells, questions about cultural practices, assumptions about academic abilities based on race. I organized them into a new folder. This one was different. It wasn't asking for justice for Arjun. It was demanding protection for the kids still in her classroom. The next school board meeting was packed. I hadn't organized it, but word had spread. Parents filled every seat. Some held signs with their children's names. Others just sat quietly, finally ready to be witnessed. When public comment opened, we lined up. One by one, parents shared their stories. The board president tried to cut us off after the usual time limit, but the crowd wouldn't let him. "Let them speak," someone shouted. Others joined in. Mrs. Squelch sat in the front row with her union representative. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the victim perfectly. During a break, I heard her tell someone that she was being targeted for maintaining high standards. The meeting went past midnight. The board promised to investigate. They used all the right words about taking concerns seriously, but I'd heard those words before. They meant nothing without action. I went home and sat in Arjun's room. His science textbook was still on his desk, open to a chapter about chemical reactions. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd been an excellent student, curious and eager to learn, until someone taught him he was dirty. The next morning, I got a call from Maria Santos. Her daughter had been in Mrs. Squelch's class 5 years ago. They'd moved to another state, but she'd seen my posts online. She had recordings. Her daughter had worn a wire after the first incident, trying to protect herself. "I never did anything with them," Maria said. "I was undocumented then. I was terrified they'd retaliate, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She sent me everything. The recordings were devastating." Mrs. Squelch's voice was clear and casual as she made comments about those people and their neighborhoods. She assigned seats based on race, keeping minority students in the back. She graded harder, commented more harshly, and found ways to exclude them from activities. I transcribed every word, dated every incident, cross-referenced with the complaints. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't unconscious bias or cultural misunderstanding. This was deliberate, systematic discrimination. But I knew the district would find a way to explain it away. They always did. They'd claim the recordings were taken out of context, that Mrs. Squelch was actually trying to help, that the real problem was parents who didn't understand her teaching methods. I needed something more, something they couldn't dismiss or minimize, something that would force them to act. That's when I remembered the security cameras. The school had installed them 2 years ago after a vandalism incident. They covered every classroom. If the district had those recordings from the day Arjun was humiliated, they'd have to see what really happened. I filed a formal records request. The district had 30 days to respond. They used every single one, then denied my request citing student privacy concerns. But they'd made a mistake. They'd admitted the recordings existed. My lawyer was a young woman named Jennifer, who'd reached out after seeing my story online. She worked pro bono, driven by her own experiences in school. She filed appeals, cited precedents, and slowly forced the district to acknowledge they had evidence they were hiding. While we waited for legal processes, I kept documenting. More families came forward. Some had moved away years ago, but still carried the trauma. Others were currently watching their children struggle in Mrs. Squelch's class, afraid to speak up until now. The stack of evidence grew. Emails, recordings, written complaints, witness statements. Each piece on its own might be dismissed. Together, they painted a picture of a teacher who'd been allowed to damage children for over a decade. Mrs. Squelch tried to control the narrative. She gave an interview to the local paper about being persecuted for maintaining high standards. She started a social media campaign about canceling cancel culture in education. Some parents rallied to her defense, praising her tough love approach. But for every supporter, 3 more families found the courage to share their stories. The dam had broken. Years of silence and fear washed away in a flood of truth. I spent my nights organizing evidence and my days trying to remember how to breathe. Grief and rage took turns consuming me. Sometimes I'd forget for a moment that Arjun was gone, then remember with fresh pain that cut deeper each time. The district finally agreed to an independent investigation. They hired a firm from out of state, promising transparency and accountability. I wanted to believe them, but I'd learned that promises from people in power were worth less than nothing. The investigation would take months. Meanwhile, Mrs. Squelch kept teaching. Every day, she walked into that classroom where my son had been destroyed. Every day, other children sat in those same seats, wondering if they'd be next. I couldn't wait for the system to work. It had already failed too many times. So I kept pushing, kept documenting, kept refusing to let them bury this like they'd buried every other complaint. Because somewhere, another 12-year-old was being taught they were dirty. Somewhere, another parent was being told their child was too sensitive. Somewhere, another family was being silenced by fear and bureaucracy. I couldn't save Arjun, but maybe I could save them. The folder on my kitchen table had grown into boxes. Boxes of pain and evidence and truth. I stared at them every morning, gathering strength for another day of fighting a system designed to protect itself. This wasn't how I'd imagined spending my days after losing my son. I'd thought grief would be quiet and private. Instead, it had become a public battle against the very people who should have protected him. But I would keep fighting. For Arjun. For all the children still sitting in those classrooms. For all the parents who'd been told their concerns didn't matter. The truth was all I had left, and I would make sure everyone heard it. The investigation firm arrived 2 weeks later. 3 people in crisp suits who set up in the district conference room and began scheduling interviews. I was their first appointment. They asked careful questions about Arjun's medical history, his academic performance, his social relationships. They took notes on yellow legal pads and nodded sympathetically. When I showed them the video from Lisa Chen, they made copies and promised to review it thoroughly. Mrs. Squelch was interviewed the same afternoon. I saw her walking out as I waited in the lobby, hoping to speak with other parents. She looked directly at me and smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind that said she knew something I didn't. That evening, my phone rang. The principal's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. He informed me that Mrs. Squelch had filed a restraining order. I was no longer allowed within 500 feet of the school. Any attempt to contact her, directly or indirectly, would result in criminal charges. Jennifer reviewed the paperwork the next morning. Mrs. Squelch claimed I had been stalking her, making threats, encouraging others to harass her. She'd submitted screenshots of social media posts where parents had tagged her, demanding answers. She'd documented every school board meeting where I'd spoken. She'd even included a photo of my car in the school parking lot, claiming I was surveilling her. The restraining order meant I couldn't attend school board meetings. I couldn't drop off evidence at the district office. I couldn't even drive past the school where my son had suffered, but I could still make phone calls. I spent hours reaching out to every family whose child had been in Mrs. Squelch's class over the past decade. Most conversations ended quickly. Parents were polite but firm. They didn't want to get involved. They had other children in the district. They couldn't risk retaliation. A few listened longer. They shared stories in hushed voices, afraid even in their own homes. A mother whose daughter stopped eating lunch after Mrs. Squelch commented on the smell of her Korean food. A father whose son was told his people's music was too loud during a presentation about jazz. Small cruelties that added up to systematic destruction. I started a spreadsheet. Names, dates, incidents, outcomes. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look, but the district wasn't willing. The investigation firm sent a follow-up letter. They needed more concrete evidence. The video was concerning, they admitted, but without corroborating testimony, it was insufficient. They encouraged me to find parents willing to speak on record. Kenji Tanaka was the first to agree. We met at his house, where he showed me his son's old homework. Red ink covered every page. Comments like, try harder to write in proper English, on essays that were grammatically perfect. Math tests marked down for showing work incorrectly when the answers were right. His son, now in high school, still flinched when talking about 5th grade. He'd developed a stutter that year, convinced his accent was wrong. Years of speech therapy hadn't completely fixed it. Together, we drafted a formal statement. Kenji's hands shook as he signed it. He knew what this might cost him. His daughter was still in elementary school, different teacher, same district. Maria Santos called again. She'd been following the investigation from her new home in Arizona. She wanted to help, but was terrified of being pulled back into a system that had already failed her once. After hours of conversation, she agreed to submit a written statement. Why does the principal sound angry when calling about the restraining order instead of just doing his job professionally? No recordings, she insisted. Just her family's experience. The district responded by tightening their policies. A new memo went out to all staff about appropriate interactions with parents. Any contact outside of official channels would be considered harassment. Teachers were advised to document any concerning behavior from family members. Mrs. Squelch used this to her advantage. She filed 3 more complaints in 2 weeks. I'd supposedly sent other parents to approach her at the grocery store. I'd orchestrated a campaign of online harassment. I'd made her feel unsafe in her own classroom. Each complaint required a response. Jennifer worked overtime, filing paperwork, challenging claims, trying to keep me from being arrested for seeking justice for my son. The legal bills grew. My savings disappeared. But the other parents kept coming forward. Slowly, quietly, they shared their stories. Not publicly, not officially, but in living rooms and coffee shops, they spoke their truth. I learned about the Nigerian family whose son was told his name was too difficult and he should use an American nickname. The Japanese girl who was asked if her family ate raw fish for breakfast. The Mexican boy who was seated next to the trash can because some cultures have different standards of cleanliness. Each story felt like a knife in my chest. Each child who'd suffered while adults looked away. Each family who'd been gaslit into believing they were too sensitive, too demanding, too different. The investigation firm scheduled more interviews. Parents who'd found courage in numbers began signing up. The district tried to discourage encourage participation, sending letters about the importance of not disrupting the educational environment. But momentum was building. Then, Mrs. Squelch played her next card. She announced she was taking medical leave for stress-related health issues. Her doctor, whose letterhead I recognized from the district's preferred provider list, recommended immediate time off. The union backed her completely. With Mrs. Squelch on leave, the investigation stalled. How could they investigate someone who was too fragile to participate? Her lawyer sent letters about the hostile environment created by a grieving father's misplaced anger. The narrative was shifting. She was becoming the victim. I watched the other parents begin to waver. Without Mrs. Squelch in the classroom, their immediate fear lessened. Some started to question whether pursuing this was worth it. Maybe she'd learned her lesson. Maybe she wouldn't come back. But I knew better. I'd seen this pattern in the old complaints. Take some time off, let things calm down, return when everyone had moved on. She'd done it before. She'd do it again. Jennifer suggested a different approach. If we couldn't go through the district, maybe we could go around them. She'd been researching civil rights violations in educational settings. There were precedents, cases where patterns of discrimination had been addressed at the state level. We started building a new case, not just about Mrs. Squelch, but about a system that had enabled her for over a decade. Every dismissed complaint, every transferred student, every family that had been silenced, it all pointed to institutional failure. The district caught wind of our plans. Suddenly, they were very interested in mediation. They offered to arrange a meeting, all parties present, to find a mutually beneficial resolution. The investigation was still ongoing, they assured us, but perhaps we could reach an understanding. I knew it was a trap, but Jennifer insisted we attend. We needed to show good faith effort, she explained. Courts like to see attempted resolution before litigation. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I put on my only suit, the one I'd worn to Arjun's funeral. The district brought a team of lawyers. Mrs. Squelch arrived with her union representative and personal attorney. She wore a neck brace and moved slowly, as if every step caused pain. They offered me a settlement, a small sum, barely enough to cover Arjun's funeral expenses. In exchange, I would sign a non-disclosure agreement. I would remove all social media posts. I would cease all contact with other parents regarding this matter. Mrs. Squelch would return to teaching, but with additional training. I looked at the papers in front of me. Clean, official, designed to make everything go away. Just like they'd made all the other complaints go away. Sign here, stay quiet, let it happen to someone else's child. Jennifer kicked me under the table. She wanted me to counter, to negotiate, but I couldn't speak. All I could see was Arjun's face in that hospital bed, asking if he was clean enough. I pushed the papers back unsigned and walked out. That night, the phone calls started. Other parents who'd been contacted by the district offered similar deals, money for silence. Most were considering it. They had bills to pay, other children to protect. They couldn't afford to keep fighting. I understood. I was running out of money too. The credit cards were maxed. The mortgage was overdue. Fighting systems designed to outlast you was expensive. But then Lisa Chen knocked on my door. She was 16 now, taller than I remembered. She asked if she could talk about what happened in 5th grade. Her parents waited in the car, too conflicted to come in, but unwilling to stop her. She told me about the day Mrs. Squelch had humiliated Arjun, how she'd wanted to say something but was too scared, how she'd watched him shrink into himself, then try to disappear, how the other kids had followed Mrs. Squelch's lead because that's what kids do. She told me about her own experiences, being asked if her family ate cats, being told her eyes were too small to see the board properly, being moved to the back of the classroom with the other Asian students for similar learning styles. But mostly, she talked about Arjun, how kind he'd been, how he'd shared his snacks even after everyone started calling him names, how he'd still helped other kids with science homework even when they wouldn't sit with him. She cried when she talked about his empty desk, how Mrs. Squelch had made a comment about the air quality improving, how some kids had laughed, how she'd gone home and thrown up. Her parents finally came in. Her mother held my hand and apologized for not speaking up sooner. Her father promised they would testify, publicly if needed. They were done being afraid. Word spread about the Chen family's decision. Other families reconsidered their silence. The district's settlement offers had backfired. Instead of buying quiet, they'd revealed how much they had to hide. The next school board meeting was scheduled for Thursday. I couldn't attend because of the restraining order, but Jennifer would read my statement. Other parents planned to speak. The investigation firm had promised a preliminary report. On Wednesday, Mrs. Squelch returned to school. Her medical leave had been surprisingly short. She posted on social media about being strong for her students, about not letting bullies win. Her supporters rallied, praising her dedication. That afternoon, a new family called. Their son was in Mrs. Squelch's current class. That morning, she'd made a comment about some cultures not valuing education properly when he'd forgotten his homework. The boy was Pakistani. He was 7 years old. The cycle was starting again. I spent that night writing, not a statement for the board, but a letter to Arjun, telling him about the families who'd found their voices, about the children who might be protected, about the small crack we'd put in a system designed to be impenetrable. I told him I was sorry. Sorry I hadn't seen it sooner. Sorry I hadn't fought harder while he was alive. Sorry that he'd felt so dirty he'd poisoned himself trying to be clean. But I also told him about hope, about Lisa Chen's courage, about parents standing up, about truth being harder to bury when enough people were watching. The school board meeting arrived. Jennifer sent me updates by text. The room was packed. Parents spoke for hours. The investigation firm presented their preliminary findings, careful and corporate, but confirming a pattern of concerning incidents. Mrs. Squelch's supporters showed up too. They talked about high standards and academic excellence. They accused parents of playing the race card. They said children were too coddled these days. The board listened to everyone. They thanked participants for their input. They promised careful consideration. They scheduled another meeting for next month. Mrs. Squelch kept teaching, but something had shifted. Parents were talking to each other now, not in whispers, but openly. They were comparing experiences, sharing strategies, refusing to be isolated. A group formed, Parents for Inclusive Education. They met weekly, documenting new incidents, supporting affected families, pushing for real change. I couldn't attend because of the restraining order, but they kept me informed. The investigation continued, slowly and bureaucratically. More interviews, more documentation, more careful legal language. The firm requested extensions. The district district approved them. Time kept passing. Meanwhile, Mrs. Squelch adapted. Her comments became subtler. Nothing as obvious as before. Just enough to hurt, not enough to prove. She'd learned from the scrutiny, but the parents were learning too. They recorded everything. They saved emails. They taught their children to speak up. The paper trail grew. 3 months after the investigation started, Jennifer called with news. The state education department had agreed to review our case. Not just Mrs. Squelch, but the district's pattern of handling discrimination complaints. It wasn't a victory, just another step in an endless process, but it was movement. The district panicked. Suddenly, they were very interested in resolution. They offered a new settlement, bigger this time. The timing of that neck brace seems awfully convenient. Mrs. Squelch shows up to mediation looking like she's the one who needs protecting. Medical leave that ends right before the board meeting, just long enough to dodge the heat but short enough to keep her job. They proposed policy changes. They suggested Mrs. Squelch might be better suited for a different role, but they still wouldn't admit wrongdoing. They still wouldn't acknowledge the pattern. They still wanted silence in exchange for action. I was tired. Bone deep, soul-crushing tired. Fighting systems wasn't just expensive financially. It cost everything. Sleep, health, hope. Some days I wondered if Arjun would want this, if he'd want his memory tied to an endless battle. Then another child would come forward. Another family would share their story. Another parent would find courage in collective action. And I'd remember that this wasn't just about Arjun anymore. It was about every child who'd been taught they were less than. The state review began. Investigators arrived, different from the district's firm. They interviewed everyone again. They requested documents the district had claimed didn't exist. They asked uncomfortable questions. Mrs. Squelch hired a new lawyer, a more expensive one. She started her own documentation, claiming harassment and discrimination. She positioned herself as a victim of cancel culture, a dedicated teacher being destroyed by political correctness. Some people believed her. They wrote letters of support. They showed up at board meetings to defend her. They accused me of using my son's death for attention. Those were the hardest days. When strangers who'd never met Arjun felt comfortable judging his pain. When people who'd never sat in Mrs. Squelch's classroom declared her innocent. When the truth got buried under politics and polarization. But the evidence kept growing. More families came forward. Some from years past. Former students, now adults, shared their experiences. Teachers who'd witnessed incidents but been afraid to speak started talking. One teacher, close to retirement, told investigators about staff meetings where Mrs. Squelch had complained about those kinds of families, about how administrators had laughed along, about how she'd been told to mind her own classroom when she'd raised concerns. The union tried to discredit her. She was bitter, they said, jealous of Mrs. Squelch's success, but she had dates, quotes, corroborating witnesses. Other teachers, emboldened, began to confirm her accounts. The investigation expanded. Now it wasn't just about one teacher, but about a culture that had enabled discrimination for years. The district hired crisis management consultants. Board members started resigning, citing personal reasons. Mrs. Squelch took another medical leave. This time she didn't announce when she'd return. Her classroom got a long-term substitute. Parents breathed a little easier, but I knew it wasn't over. Systems didn't change because of one investigation. People in power didn't give it up easily. Mrs. Squelch would return, or someone like her would take her place unless something fundamental shifted. So we kept working, building coalitions with other districts facing similar issues, creating resources for parents dealing with discrimination, training families to document and report effectively. The state investigation concluded 6 months after it began. Their report was damning but careful. They found significant concerns and patterns requiring attention. They recommended training, policy changes, better oversight. They stopped short of demanding anyone be fired. The district accepted the recommendations. They hired diversity consultants. They revised their complaint procedures. They scheduled mandatory training for all staff. They did everything except admit they'd been wrong. Mrs. Squelch announced her retirement. After decades of dedicated service, she said, it was time to move on. The district praised her commitment to education. They organized a farewell celebration. I wasn't invited, of course. The restraining order was still in effect, but other parents went. They wanted to witness the end, to make sure she was really leaving. She gave a speech about maintaining high standards, about not lowering expectations, about the importance of preparing all students for success. She never mentioned the children she'd damaged along the way. Some people called it justice. The bad teacher was gone. The district had new policies. The investigation was complete. Time to move forward. But I stood in Arjun's room that night, looking at his science fair trophy, and felt hollow. She got to retire with dignity. She got to keep her pension. She got to pretend she was a victim. Arjun got a grave. The other families tried to comfort me. Change had happened, they said. Future children would be protected. We'd made a difference. Maybe they were right. Maybe the new policies would help. Maybe the next teacher who wanted to humiliate a child would think twice. Maybe administrators would actually listen to complaints. Or maybe they'd just get better at hiding it. I kept the boxes of evidence, just in case, because systems had short memories and people in power counted on exhaustion. They knew most people couldn't fight forever, but I could. Not because I was special or strong, but because every morning I woke up in a house too quiet, made breakfast for one, and remembered a 12-year-old boy who'd hammered poison trying to be clean enough for a world that had taught him he was dirty. For him, I could fight forever. The new school year started. Different teacher, same classroom. Parents watched carefully, documented everything, stayed vigilant. The district watched back, waiting for attention to fade. And somewhere, in some other classroom, another child was learning they didn't belong. Another teacher was making comments just subtle enough to deny. Another system was protecting itself instead of its students. The cycle continued. But now, at least, some people were watching. Some parents were prepared. Some children might be protected. It wasn't justice. It wasn't enough. It would never bring Arjun back. But it was what I had. Truth, persistence, and the hope that somewhere, some child would be spared what my son had endured. The investigation was over. The teacher was gone. The policies were changed. The real work was just beginning. The retirement celebration was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Parents for Inclusive Education decided to organize their own gathering that same evening. A counter-celebration, they called it, for the children who'd been hurt. I watched from my car across the street as families arrived at the community center. The restraining order kept kept me from joining them, but I needed to see this through. Jennifer sat beside me, reviewing the final state report on her tablet. Inside, I knew they were sharing stories. Not the sanitized versions they'd given investigators, but the raw truth. The Vietnamese girl who'd stopped bringing lunch from home. The black boy who'd started believing he wasn't smart enough. The Mexican child who'd scrubbed his hands raw after being seeded by the trash. My phone buzzed with updates from parents inside. They were creating a memorial wall, photos of children who'd left the school, quotes from the complaints that had been ignored, a timeline showing how long this had gone on. Mrs. Squelch's supporters held their own gathering at a restaurant downtown. Someone leaked photos on social media, champagne toasts and speeches about excellence in education. The principal was there, raising his glass. That weekend, I started getting calls. Parents whose children would be in 5th grade next year. They'd heard about everything and wanted advice. How to document incidents, what warning signs to watch for, how to protect their kids. I created a simple guide, 1 page, bullet points, what to record, how to file complaints, who to contact. Jennifer reviewed it for legal issues. We printed copies at the local library and left stacks at coffee shops near the school. The district sent another cease and desist letter. I was interfering with school operations, they claimed, creating unnecessary panic among parents. Jennifer filed it with all the others. Monday morning brought unexpected news. The long-term substitute in Mrs. Squelch's classroom had quit. She'd lasted 3 days. Parents reported she'd found lesson plans full of cultural awareness activities that made her uncomfortable, seating charts organized by ethnicity, grade books with concerning patterns. The district scrambled to find another substitute. 3 more quit within 2 weeks. Word had spread among local teachers. No one wanted to be associated with that classroom. Finally, they brought in Ms. Rodriguez from another school, young, idealistic, determined to make a difference. She immediately rearranged the classroom, mixed up the seating, and sent home a letter introducing herself to families. The Pakistani boy's mother called me that night. Her son had come home smiling for the first time in months. Ms. Rodriguez had pronounced his name correctly and asked him to teach the class how to say it. Small victory. But I'd learned not to trust those. The next school board meeting approached. I still couldn't attend, but the Parents for Inclusive Education had grown. They'd elected officers, created committees, established a phone tree. They were organized now. Jennifer filed a motion to lift the restraining order. The judge scheduled a hearing. Mrs. Squelch would have to appear and justify why she still felt threatened by a grieving father she no longer worked with. The hearing was set for the same day as the board meeting. I had to choose. Fight for my right to participate, or let the parents handle it while I dealt with legal matters. I chose the hearing. Some battles you fight for principle. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Mrs. Squelch arrived with her expensive lawyer. She'd abandoned the neck brace but moved slowly, deliberately, playing a part. Her lawyer argued I was obsessed, dangerous, unpredictable in my grief. He presented the social media posts, the school visits, the organization of parent protests. Mrs. Squelch gets to retire with full benefits after destroying children's self-worth for years. Her supporters are toasting champagne while families create memorial walls for the kids she hurt. He painted a picture of a man who couldn't let go. Jennifer countered with facts. No actual threats, no direct contact. A father seeking accountability through proper channels. She showed how Mrs. Squelch had weaponized the legal system to silence criticism. The judge listened to both sides. He asked Mrs. Squelch directly if she still felt threatened. She dabbed at her eyes and nodded, voice trembling as she described her fear. Then he asked why she'd attended a public celebration if she was so afraid, why she'd posted on social media about her retirement party, why she'd given interviews to local media. Her lawyer objected. The judge overruled him. The restraining order was lifted. Mrs. Squelch's lawyer immediately announced they'd appeal. The judge reminded them that filing frivolous appeals could result in sanctions. I drove straight to the school board meeting, walked in during public comment. The room erupted. Parents stood and applauded. Board members looked uncomfortable. I hadn't spoken publicly in months. I took my 3 minutes, didn't talk about Mrs. Squelch, didn't mention the investigation or the lawsuits or the pain. Instead, I read names. Every child from every complaint, every family who'd been silenced, every student who'd been taught they were less than. The board president tried to cut me off. The crowd wouldn't let him. They started chanting the names with me. Lisa Chen, Kenji Tanaka's son, Maria Santos's daughter, all the others. Security moved toward me. Parents formed a protective circle. The meeting devolved into chaos. Board members fled to their offices. The police were called, but we kept reading names. The next morning, the superintendent announced her resignation. Personal reasons, she said. Time for new leadership. The board president followed suit by noon. Mrs. Squelch's supporters organized their own response. Letters to the editor about mob rule. Social media campaigns about the destruction of educational standards. They painted themselves as victims of political correctness. But more families kept coming forward. A former student, now in college, wrote a public essay about her 5th grade experience. How Mrs. Squelch had made her hate her own culture. How it had taken years of therapy to undo the damage. The essay went viral locally, not national news, just shared among parents and educators in our area. Other former students found courage to share their stories. The pattern became undeniable. The school board called an emergency meeting. They needed to hire a new superintendent, set policies for the new year, address the growing crisis of confidence. This time, hundreds of parents attended, not just those who'd been hurt, but others who'd stayed silent. They demanded transparency, accountability, real change. The board announced a nationwide search for a new superintendent. They promised community input. They established a diversity committee with actual power. Small steps, but steps forward. Mrs. Squelch tried one last manipulation. She filed a defamation lawsuit against me, Jennifer, and the Parents for Inclusive Education. Claimed we'd destroyed her reputation with lies. Demanded damages for emotional distress. Jennifer laughed when she read the filing. Mrs. Squelch had made a crucial mistake. In claiming defamation, she'd opened herself up to discovery. We could now legally demand all her records, emails, and documentation. Her lawyer tried to withdraw the suit 2 days later. Jennifer wouldn't let him. If Mrs. Squelch wanted to play legal games, we were ready. The discovery process revealed everything. Years of emails mocking students, messages to other teachers rating children by ethnicity, documentation documentation of her deliberate grading bias, even a journal where she'd written about her mission to maintain standards against demographic changes. Her own words condemned her more than we ever could. The district's insurance company stepped in. They saw the liability and wanted to settle everything quickly, offered a larger sum to make all the lawsuits go away. The families met to discuss it. Some needed the money, others wanted to keep fighting. In the end, we agreed to settle with conditions. The money would create a scholarship fund for minority students. The district would implement mandatory bias training, and Mrs. Squelch's personnel file would be marked to prevent her from teaching anywhere else. She fought that last part hardest. Her lawyer argued it was vindictive, would destroy her ability to work. Jennifer pointed out that protecting children was more important than protecting careers. The settlement was finalized in October. Mrs. Squelch moved out of state shortly after. Her supporters gradually went quiet. The new superintendent started in November, bringing fresh perspectives and genuine commitment to change. Ms. Rodriguez was offered a permanent position. She accepted on the condition that she could completely redesign the 5th grade curriculum. The district agreed. The Parents for Inclusive Education became a permanent organization. They monitored classrooms, supported families, and pushed for continuous improvement. I served as an unofficial advisor, sharing resources and experience. One evening in December, Lisa Chen stopped by my house. She was applying to colleges, writing essays about overcoming adversity. She wanted to include Arjun's story, to honor his memory. I gave her permission and something more. Arjun's science notebook. He'd filled it with observations, questions, dreams of becoming a researcher. Before anyone taught him he was dirty. She cried, reading his neat handwriting, promised to carry his dream forward. She was accepted to MIT 3 months later. The first anniversary of Arjun's death approached. The families wanted to do something, create meaning from loss. We established a day of remembrance at the school, not just for Arjun, but for all the children who'd been hurt by bias. The new superintendent approved it immediately, made it an official day of reflection and education. Teachers would receive special training. Students would learn about empathy and inclusion. I visited Arjun's grave that morning, placed fresh flowers and his favorite candy, told him about the changes. The children, who were safer now, wondered if it was enough. That afternoon, I received a package, no return address. Inside was a photo album, pictures of Arjun at school I'd never seen, him helping classmates with science projects, sharing his lunch, smiling before everything changed. A note was tucked inside. I should have stood up for him. I'll spend my life standing up for others. A former classmate. The day of remembrance ceremony was held in the gymnasium. Students read poems about acceptance. Parents shared stories of resilience. The new superintendent announced a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. I sat in the back, watching children who looked like Arjun feel safe in their school. Watched parents who'd been silenced find their voices. Watched teachers commit to doing better. It wasn't justice. Arjun was still gone. Mrs. Squelch had faced no criminal consequences. The system that enabled her had only partially changed. But in that gymnasium, surrounded by people who'd fought for change, I felt something shift. Not closure, never that, but purpose. After the ceremony, families approached me. Some I knew, others were strangers. They thanked me for fighting, for not giving up, for showing them they could demand better. I started working with Jennifer on expanding our resources, creating guides for other districts, training materials for parents, warning signs to watch for, how to organize and push for change. We kept everything focused on prevention and education. No vengeance, no hatred, just tools to protect children and hold systems accountable. The work continued. Board meetings, policy reviews, constant vigilance. Because somewhere, another Mrs. Squelch was making a child feel worthless. Another system was protecting harmful adults instead of vulnerable children. But now, we knew how to fight back, how to organize and document, how to refuse silence and demand change, how to turn grief into action. I kept Arjun's photo on my desk as I worked. My beautiful boy who'd hammered poison trying to be clean enough, who died believing he was dirty, whose death had exposed a rot that might have continued forever. His legacy wasn't just pain. It was the Pakistani boy who now raised his hand confidently, the Vietnamese girl who brought her grandmother's cooking for Share Day, the black student who knew his intelligence was valued, every child who felt safe in their skin because we'd refused to let his death mean nothing. The work would never end. Systems don't change easily. Bias runs deep, but we'd proven it could be challenged, that parents united could force accountability, that one child's tragedy could protect others. I thought about Arjun's mother sometimes, how she'd died from chemicals meant to clean, how he'd followed her path, how poison came in many forms, some physical, some emotional. But I also thought about the antidote we'd found. Truth, persistence, community, the refusal to let harm continue, the demand that children be protected. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was what we had. And for all the children still sitting in classrooms, still vulnerable to adults who would teach them they were less than, we would keep fighting. Not with rage anymore. That had burned down to determination, but with the steady, relentless pressure of people who knew what was at stake. Because every child deserved to feel clean in their own skin. Every family deserved to have their concerns heard. Every classroom should be a place of growth, not destruction. The sun set outside my window as I typed another resource guide. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new opportunities to protect children. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of something close to peace. Not because we'd won, but because we'd refused to lose. Arjun was gone. That would never change. But his truth lived on in every child we protected, every family we empowered, every system we forced to change. It was his legacy, and it was enough to keep fighting for. Well, that was quite a story to go through together. Like, for more,